I'm Daniel Webster. I'm a professor here in the School of Public Health. We have a lot of guests today. That's why I'm introducing myself. This is you may not know it, but this is actually a class going on here. And this is wonderful from my standpoint to be able to both teach a class and do some of the work that I do to advance evidence-based practices and policies to reduce violence. And I'm so excited and pleased today, one, at the turnout and the interest that we have from law enforcement. And of course, because they're here because we have really one of the nation's leading experts to talk about critical issues relevant to reducing violence. And I actually think there's a lot behind Professor Tyler's work that actually extends beyond even violence, because so much of public health draws upon and relies upon laws and people obeying those laws in order to protect public health and safety. I want to let people know that we are videotaping this session. We knew that several of our seminars were going to be in great demand, not only for people to come here, but those who can't. And so we will be videotaping today's session. Tom Tyler is the Macklin Fleming Professor of Law and a Professor of Psychology at Yale Law School. He's also has an appointment in the Yale's School of Management. Professor Tyler joined Yale in January of 2012 and previously was university professor at New York University, where he taught in both psychology department and the law school. Prior to joining NYU in 1997, he taught at University of California, Berkeley and Northwestern. Professor Tyler's research explores the role of justice in shaping people's relationships with groups, organizations, communities, and societies. In particular, he examines the role of judgments about the justice or injustice of group procedures in shaping legitimacy, compliance, and cooperation. He's authored several books, including Why People Cooperate, Legitimacy in Criminal Justice, Why People Obey the Law, Trust in the Law, and Cooperation in Groups. He was awarded the Harry Calvin Prize for Paradigm Shifting Scholarship in the Study of Law and Society by the Law and Society Association, and in 2012 was honored by the International Society of Justice Research with its Lifetime Achievement Award for innovative research on social justice. I'm so happy to introduce Tom Tyler for today's seminar.
Well, thank you all for coming, and especially I know the many police officers. I know how busy things can get, so I'm pleased that you're all here to hear me talk today. I'm going to talk about a variety of issues, but they converge on the question of violence. I will give a little background to a general discussion about models of policing as a way to get to that point. I think you all know, especially the police officials that are here, that there are different issues that come to the public's attention, that become central to government, that preoccupy the police at different points in time. And there's no one model for how to do a good job policing, because the issues that are central to policing change in different periods of history. What I'm going to talk about is an issue that is becoming very important right now. And we can think of a lot of different ways to demonstrate that something might be important right now. When I was listening to the news this morning, I was, of course, pleased, but also surprised to discover that yesterday President Obama, in his weekly interview, this time with ABC News, said, "What's the most important issue in policing today in America? It's the police having trust in different communities." That has been a theme that the Attorney General Holder, has touched on a variety of times recently. You might think that those statements are a response to Ferguson, but actually that's not true. This has been something that the Attorney General has been saying for several years. At the most recent International Association of the Chiefs of Police, he gave a speech where he basically said the same thing that he said more recently. So this is at least several years of federal effort in this direction. But maybe we don't want to focus on the federal government. Maybe we should talk about some prominent police chiefs. Commissioner Bratton in New York City, when he was interviewed about why was he a suitable person to be a commissioner in New York City, talked about his work in Los Angeles. What about his work in Los Angeles? That he was able to build trust in minority communities. And that was why he was a suitable candidate to be in charge in New York. Superintendent McCarthy in Chicago, when he became the superintendent in Chicago, the first thing that he did was to institute a set of programs to try to rebuild trust between the Chicago police and different communities. So there are a lot of different suggestions from different people that at this particular moment, an issue that should be central to policing in many American communities is the question of public trust, confidence in the police. Well, why would public trust and confidence, which I'll call police legitimacy, be important? In order to understand that, we have to consider a paradox regarding policing in America. It is the case, and I'm sure most of the police authorities who are here realize it, that the quality of American policing has improved substantially in recent decades on a whole variety of different indicators, whether it's a greater ability to effectively fight crime, whether it's a decline in unlawful shootings, and even though we do have high visibility events such as Ferguson, it's also important to recognize that historically the rate of those events has gone down substantially in America. And other similar criterion. So from a performance evaluation perspective, there's a lot to feel good about concerning policing in America today. On the other hand, at the same time, during this period, public support for and trust in the police legitimacy in the sense of legitimacy in the eyes of the community, trust in the community, has not increased at a similar rate, especially among members of minority groups. So we see increasing objective performance, but not increasing public trust. Well, in order to talk more about that, let me just first say what I mean by legitimacy. I'm not talking about legal legitimacy. I'm talking about perceived legitimacy in the community, that the public thinks that the police are entitled to exercise authority in their community, that they believe that they should trust and have confidence in the police. They believe that they should defer to police authority. They believe that police actions are morally appropriate and therefore should be accepted as decisions about how to maintain order, how to manage conflict, how to solve problems in their community. So trust and confidence. In the last 30 years, this 1980, what you see is that public trust and confidence in the police in America has been basically flat. So there hasn't been any increase. And the level is somewhat, say, moderately positive. Between 50 and 60% of adult Americans say they have trust in their local police, which of course means that around 40 to 50% say they don't. Particularly troubling is the large and continuing racial gap. This is an example from the Pew Center. There is something like a 20% gap with African Americans expressing less trust and confidence in the police than white Americans. And importantly, this gap is not gone. It's not reduced. It's more or less the same. And so that could go back, of course, many, many, many decades. But right now, we see intermediate but somewhat positive trust and confidence that's not increasing, and we see a persistent and striking racial gap. Well, you might say, why do we care? If we know that the police, in objective terms, are doing a good job, what difference does it make how the people in the community feel? One way to think about this is that legitimacy matters because it affects what the people in the community do, how they relate to the police. And research shows that, in particular, people judge whether to obey the law or not primarily in terms of the legitimacy of the police, the courts, and the law. And that is a more important factor than fear of being caught and punished for breaking the law. So legitimacy is first important because it affects public behavior. Another way to put this is people who don't trust the police are more likely to commit crimes. All right. More generally, beyond simple compliance, the point is we're losing the potential benefits of popular legitimacy. And there are a variety, all kinds. Public behavior, decision acceptance, compliance, cooperation. Let me talk about those in a little more detail. First, when the police deal with citizens, and as you know, the police are the primary contact point between the public and government. The public is more likely to deal with a police officer than any other government official. During those interactions, if people don't trust the police, they're less likely to accept police authority. They're less likely to voluntarily defer to what the police tell them to do. And they're less likely to continue to do that once the officer is left. So the police have to keep coming back to the same situation over and over again. And in particular, if people trust the police are less likely to encounter resistance and hostility. As an example, I don't know what happened in Ferguson, but I do know that there was a conflict between a police officer and a person out on the street. Those kind of conflicts are not uncommon. We find them in about 30% of police stops of various degrees of force. That number goes down when people trust the police. In addition, as I said, if people trust the police in their everyday lives, they're more likely to obey the law. They're more likely to cooperate with the police, report crime and criminals, work with the police, neighborhood watch, community meetings, and less likely to engage in extra-legal actions, violence, collective action, riots. When you see a situation where the population is out buying guns and the police are out buying riot equipment because everyone's thinking there's going to be extra-legal action occurring, you realize that's bad. And it's a reflection of a lack of trust between the police and the community. All right. Well, so how can we address that issue? I think that the main point is that we need to think about how police policies and practices are affected by the public, that the public looks at these policies and practices, they judge them, and that then affects the way the public deals with the police, especially the minority community. So we need to think about the issue of public trust and confidence as an issue in and of itself. How are the police experienced by the community? Those of you who've been police officers for a long time, or those of you who studied policing, know that this is not a new idea. This is an idea that comes out of some of the concepts of community policing that we talked about a lot in the 1960s and 1970s. Focus on how the community views the police, build cooperative relationships with the community. What's new now is there's a whole new body of research that tells us more about how to do that, how to make that work, and that's what I'm talking to you about today. All right. And if you want to push even further back, one of the founders of the idea of professional policing, Robert Peel in London, talked about the general concept of policing by consent, that police needed the approval, acceptance, and cooperation of the public to be effective as police. So that idea is coming back now. As I said, it's important today, but it has historical roots in a lot of discussions about policing over time. All right. Now, the part that is new and that I think is helpful in terms of thinking about what this might mean is in a discussion about why the police are legitimate. Why would the public trust or not trust police officers? And here I'm going to tell you something that I hope I will be able to show you is well established in research, although it may initially surprise you. The primary issue that people focus on and think about when they're reacting to dealing with a police officer is not the outcome, not whether they get a ticket, don't get a ticket, get arrested, don't get arrested. It's whether they think that that officer exercised their authority in a fair way, a concept that's called procedural justice. Did the officer use fair procedures in dealing with them in deciding what to do? And I would repeat again, because it's very clear, that matters more to people than the outcome of the interaction. All right. Well, what does this abstract concept of procedural justice really mean in reality? What does it mean? There are 4 issues that members of the public talk about when they are discussing what it means to get fair or unfair treatment, and I'll talk about them. 2 are about quality of decision making, 2 are about quality of treatment. So let me start with decision making. First thing that people want is voice. People feel that they are entitled to have an opportunity to tell their story, state their case, make their argument before a policy is created or a decision is made by a police officer in a particular situation. So people think they should have a chance to have input so that the officer is making a decision that takes into account their point of view. Neutrality. People go to the police because they believe that the police are neutral, they're not biased, they apply the rules consistently, they treat everyone the same, they make decisions based upon the merits of a case and not in terms of personal relationships or biases. Now, I believe from my experience with the police that that's almost always true. But the problem is that being neutral is not the same as being seen as neutral. And what people are looking for is some way that they can understand that the decision was neutral. Transparency, accountability, in other words, explaining these are the rules, this is how I'm applying the rules, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing, so that people have a basis for knowing that the decisions that are being made are neutral. Quality of treatment. Respect. One of the central issues that people focus on when they evaluate contacts with the police is how they were treated as a human being, as a person. Did they receive respect? Were they treated with courtesy and dignity? As people, were they acknowledged as citizens who have a right to a certain quality of treatment, not a right to the outcome they want, but to respect as a member of the community? So people care about how they're treated. And then finally, people care about their understanding of the motives of the officers. Were the officers trying to do what's right? Were they trying to do what was good for the people involved, good for the people of the community? Are they sincere? Are they benevolent in their intentions? Well, of course, those are all judgments. How can you affect those judgments? One way is to acknowledge the concerns that people express, to show that you have listened and are aware of the person. You're taking them seriously. I think a thing that is important to remember here is that although you deal with hundreds of people every day, those people have often very few experiences with the police, and those experiences are very important to them as a message about their standing in the community, their relationship to government. And they are looking for respect for their concerns in terms of acknowledgement of those concerns and an account for how those concerns are taken into account when a decision is being made, even if they're not getting what they want. So 4 factors, always important. Those are the factors that define fair or unfair treatment. So the basic argument is treat people fairly, they think you're legitimate, they accept your decisions, they follow the law, they cooperate with the police. That's the argument. Well, let me show you some evidence about how powerful these effects can be. This is a study of street stops in California. It's done in Oakland and Los Angeles, focuses on the minority community. And the question is, why do people defer to police authority? They accept the decisions, they abide by the decisions, they don't complain, they don't resist. Why? So these are people with a recent experience with the police. One way you could react is your outcome good or bad? Another way you could react is, was I treated through fair procedures by the officer? And then the question, do I accept and go along with the decision that that officer made, what I should do, the rule I should follow? Okay, so this is a much more complicated analysis that I'm making simpler to make clear what I think is the main point. There are 3 factors, and the height of each column is the weight of that factor in affecting willingness to accept police decisions. So this is outcome favorability in yellow, fair outcome in blue, and then fair procedure in red. 2 main points. One, the overwhelming factor that affects whether people accept or resist, fight against police decisions is whether they think that the officer used fair procedures. Voice, neutrality, respect, and trustworthiness. And that is true for the 3 major groups in California: white, African American, and Hispanic. So race group differences are not central here. Everyone is looking for and reacting to whether they do or don't feel that they get fair treatment from the officer. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? Here, what I've done is I've divided people up in 2 ways. They got a good or bad outcome, and they said they were fairly or unfairly treated. And then this is the percentage of people who accepted the decision. So clearly, you can get some greater acceptance by delivering better outcomes, and it's about a 10% increase. But you can get about a 70% increase in acceptance if the person thinks that you treated them fairly. And in particular, even if it's a bad outcome, I got the ticket, I got arrested, whatever, people are 70% more likely to accept that outcome if they say the officer was fair to me. So again, the importance of fair treatment in reactions to police authority. The other part of this study is about calls for service, and we all know that there are many calls for service, 911 calls. What affects how people react to those calls? Exactly the same thing. Were people satisfied with the way the police handled their call for service? Main issue here, not whether you didn't solve the problem or you did solve the problem, but did you treat those people fairly? So I treated you fairly, but I didn't solve your problem. About 60% more likely to say I'm satisfied with the police and the way they handled my call. So you stop the person calls you, same message. All right. So my argument is that we should treat every encounter that the public has with the police as a moment for teaching them about why they should trust the police, why they should respect the police. And the way we do that is we focus on how we treat people. That doesn't mean you can't arrest a person who's breaking the rules. It means treat people to teach them about the fairness of the police, so they trust the police. I'll use an example from research on New York City. As you all know, New York City has become famous or infamous, I don't know how we think of it, for its widespread use of police stops. And we need a larger framework, the framework I'm going to talk to you about for understanding what are the consequences of that kind of policy. In the past, when we have talked about policies like police stops, there have been two things that have dominated the conversation. One is, are they legal? Lots of discussion about Terry standards and what those mean. And the other is, are they effective? Do they actually lower the crime rate?
Not everyone will know what Terry is. Can you just take a...
Oh yeah, sure, okay. So Terry is the law about when it's legitimate for a police officer to stop someone on the street. It says that there should be reasonable suspicion that a crime is occurring, and that is the legal standard against which police action is judged. And then effectiveness, of course, is does it lower the crime rate? Good, okay. All right. Well, the problem with both of these discussions, from my point of view, is there's no agreement about what's the message. After decades of disagreement in New York City, where, as you know, we have plenty of great lawyers and lots of criminologists, people still can't agree about how to answer those questions. Now, I'll talk about only the second question, safety, which is an empirical question. I won't talk about law and the Terry stop standard of legality. We don't know. We can't figure out if street stops lower the crime rate. And for example, very few of the street stops find drugs or guns, less than 1 in 100. But, you know, does that show the policy works? Ray Kelly would say, well, that's because people are afraid to go out on the street with a gun because they think they'll be stopped. Other people say, no, the stops don't work. They don't find guns. It's very difficult to know how to evaluate the policy from an empirical point of view. All right. My view is that as long as the police feel that the policy is effective, they're going to follow it. And so the question is, does it actually help to reduce crime? I would argue that the way to think about that, and here we're getting into the question of violence, is that whatever the short-term gains are, they're offset by the long-term undermining of police legitimacy, which then has the consequence of causing more crime in the future. Okay, so if we undermine legitimacy, whatever are the short-term gains, there may be long-term losses. We need to think about the goals of policing towards a long-term strategy for reducing violence, and I would argue that thinking about how to build trust is the way to do that. All right. Well, I already said that legitimacy is important, so I think the question is, does a policy like stop, question, and frisk undermine legitimacy? That's the really crucial question here. I'll tell you about a recent study. This is the experience of young men in New York City. This is a random sample of the young men living in New York City, and it looks at how they're affected by being stopped by the police in New York City. I won't go into all these details, but the point is this is a great sample. Worked really hard, got a great sample, trust me. And this shows it's very diverse. All right. But here's what we're really interested in. In this sample, is it really true that legitimacy is shaping important behavior, and then consequently, how is a street stop affecting that legitimacy? We use a complicated methodology, which I won't go into, just show you what we really care about. That is, if we control on all kinds of different other things that might be important, if people think the police are legitimate, they're less likely to be involved in crime, they're more likely to cooperate with the police, and they're more likely to do things like serve on a jury. Now, it's hard to interpret numbers like this, but here's the basic point. If we control for the trajectory of a young person, the likelihood that they will be a criminal based upon their long-term criminal history and other factors that predict being a career criminal, we have an estimate of the likelihood that they will engage in criminal activity, and we can then look at the effect of stops and how people experience those stops on that activity. And that's where we see the stops are important in legitimacy. Okay, so that's where we look at stops as a potential factor driving a decline in legitimacy and leading to these increases in criminal behavior. If we look at the stops themselves, the key issue is that when people have experiences with the police and they do or don't think those experiences are fair, that affects their resistance or acceptance of authority, their feelings, but more importantly, it affects their sense of legitimacy. So people who experience the police as unfair, when they're stopped, are less likely to think the police are legitimate, which then is more likely to push them further into engaging in criminal activity. This is the most important factor. It's not being stopped per se, it's being treated unfairly. That's central. All right. So the key issue is not stops, but unfair treatment. And if young men experience the police as treating them unfairly, then they view the police as less legitimate and they move into committing more crimes. I mentioned experience. We can also do a panel study where we look at people before and after they deal with the police, that controls for their prior views about the police. We get the same thing. How do people feel when after they're stopped by the police, removing how they felt before? They're reacting with negative feelings and less acceptance if they think the police are treating them unfairly. And furthermore, that goes then to their general view about the legitimacy of the police. Okay. Now, obviously, one question here is whether we're just saying to police officers, you can do whatever you want, but be nice to people. And I don't mean that, because if we look at cumulative stops for young men in New York City, we see that if you're repeatedly stopped, you then come to feel that the police have no reason to stop you and they're not treating you fairly. So while initial stops, fairness matters, over time, the repeated pattern of being stopped undermines the justifications for legitimacy and undermines legitimacy. All right. So over time, stops undermine the basis of police legitimacy. All right. Now, what about the people who are not being stopped? Why do they think that the police are legitimate or not legitimate? If we just look at people in general, again, the key issue for them in thinking about whether the police are legitimate, the general community, do the police fairly involve the community in making policy, and do they fairly involve the community in implementing policy? So the key issues here, policies are created fairly and they're implemented fairly. Also, the police act legally and the police perform effectively. But I want to emphasize that when people in the community say the police are effective, those people who say the police engage in fewer stops and are less intrusive into people's lives say the police are more effective. So effectiveness does not mean intruding into people's lives, stopping people. It actually, that undermines perceived effectiveness. All right. So what's the overall message? We should try to build popular legitimacy, build trust and confidence. In this case, this policy, the way it's been implemented, has had the effect of damage to legitimacy, which increases long-term crime. And so when we hear the statement that this policy lowers crime, we have to think about short-term versus long-term. And in the long term, it's undermining legitimacy, and in that way, it's compromising public safety because it's creating criminals, basically. All right. So as I said, controlling on the likelihood of criminal conduct, being treated unfairly by the police increases current crime activity. In fact, it doubles it. So people who've had unfair experiences are twice as likely to be criminals now, controlling for their trajectory to be a criminal. All right. Broader message, we should focus on how the law is experienced by the population. And why? Because all kinds of public behavior are affected by how the public experiences policing. I also think it's really important to show that we can move a focus in law away from compliance to willing acceptance and voluntary cooperation. So we don't have the heavy costs that we have now associated with surveillance, associated with incarceration. We have people more willingly accepting authority. So if we imagine a model, we want to increase legitimacy, we want to decrease the role of sanctions, and we want more cooperation and less incarceration. And we use legitimacy as a way to do that. Now, there's really one final point for me to make, and then I'll stop, and that is we want to shift the way we think about the relationship between law and the community from compliance to cooperation. And here's the reason. You know now we live in an era when local government services are retreating, when the police and everybody else are struggling for resources. And we live in a time of great economic difficulty for many Americans. What we really need to do is to create the conditions for social solidarity and economic development in different communities. And the police are central to doing that. The law reassures people. Even the people who never actually use police services want to feel that they can trust the police, that the police will treat them fairly if they ever deal with them. And this is important as a way to encourage people in communities to work together to solve problems. I've been at a number of meetings with police chiefs in recent years, and I think the thing that they say the most, you cannot arrest your way out of crime. The only way to really solve the problems of violence and crime is economic and social development. We need people to identify with communities, to participate in communities, economically to participate in communities, and to work together as neighbors in different communities to help solve community problems. So I'll give you one final piece of data from a national survey of Americans, and it looks at relationships between people in the community. And the question is, what really matters? Legitimacy, accuracy, lawfulness, effectiveness, or risk creation for the different kinds of behaviors that I've talked about. Now, I've summarized all this in one simple way. Why do people comply with the law? Is it because they think the law is legitimate, the police are lawful, or the police are effective? Primarily, the police are legitimate. Why do people report crimes? The police are legitimate. Why do people come and testify in court? The police are legitimate. Why do people say, I won't go out and retaliate, I'll go to the police? Because they think the police are legitimate. Why do people say, I feel comfortable going downtown and shopping in my community? Because they basically believe that they can trust the police and the way the police will treat them. Why do people say, I participate in local government? Vote, because I feel the police are legitimate. So the police are not just dealing with crime, they're projecting an image into the community that allows the community to grow as a community. And I didn't put it here, but I could. Do you trust your neighbors? If you think the police are legitimate, you're more likely to feel you could work with your neighbors. So in all these different ways, the police are central not just to crime, but to economic development, social development, to economic reemergence in different communities. And I think this is a very important and central role for the police in the future. because we do have these economic problems, and we're not going to solve problems of violence and crime unless we solve those. All right, so the point is, legitimacy is the key issue that drives all of these different kinds of behavior. So let me then just summarize. Why is this a particularly important moment to talk about trust? Because the problems of trust haven't been addressed by the many improvements in policing in the last several decades. They've remained. And so we need a strategy that focuses on those particular issues, because the police have been so effective in dealing with other issues that those issues have not become central in recent years. Now these issues are central. We have a strategy that we know works. When I recently was in Chicago and I was working with Superintendent McCarthy, Superintendent McCarthy was about to walk into a city council meeting, and he looked at me and said, "Tom, can you promise me that this will work?" And knowing that he's a police chief, his expectancy of life is precarious, I was nonetheless very confident in saying to him, yes, I can promise you this will work, because everything I've said to you is based upon a very large body of empirical research. This is empirical, this is evidence-based policy, and it's a way, a strategy, a means to achieve a goal that police leaders are saying is central to this decade of policing. So thank you.
We have a fair amount of time for questions and reactions to it.
It seemed like a really important component to this was the belief that policies are legitimate. And so from the local level, how can law enforcement be involved there when their job is to enforce the law, whether or not the...
Well, I think that the way to do that is to seek public involvement when you decide what the policies and practices of the police will be in particular communities. Like one big issue that comes up all the time is what are police priorities? And police priorities don't always agree with community priorities. In Los Angeles, for example, I mentioned Bratton. What did Bratton do to win the trust of minority communities in Los Angeles? He sent out police officers to have community meetings and ask people, what do you think are the important problems in your community? And then he actually tried to address those problems. Some of those problems were not the same kind of problems that the police might think are central, like it wasn't necessarily gun violence or drugs, it might have been disorder in the community. But the point is he showed responsiveness to the concerns that the community expressed by saying, you think this is important, so it's important to us, and we will try to address it. And the community responded by their trust in the police went up quite a lot. So that's an example of how you cooperate with the community. Sir.
I just have a quick question. When you did the study, was it taken into account the person's educational level, the person's understanding of what's right and wrong? Because some people's belief can change what is right and what's wrong. So if I believe I'm doing the right thing and the police stopping me, it could be legitimate. However, if I don't feel it's right, then how can you expect the difference between compliance and cooperation?
Right. Well, we definitely did consider education. But the bigger question you're raising, in here in various things that I showed you, I had legality. And that is not the actual legality of the stop. That's whether the person felt that it was appropriate. So, you know, if you're walking down the street with a TV and you don't think stealing it was inappropriate, then there's a difference of opinion. But we're just asking you, do you think you were doing something that the police had a legitimate reason to stop you? And you saw sometimes that was a factor that did affect how people reacted. But it was never the big factor. The big factor was, how are the police treating me? So I would say that it is an issue, but it's not the central issue that the public is reacting to when they're dealing with the police. They're reacting to how the officer treated them as a person, how the officer explained what they were doing, let them have a voice in decisions. And I also should say, although I didn't talk about it here, that people often don't have a very good sense of what the actual law is. that's a different issue, but it's a real issue that we've done other research where we look at the actual legality of a stop versus the perceived legality, and there's a very low correlation. Yes?
So the study suggests that if I make a fair or unfair stop, that would affect whether an individual will continue to offend. But does it account for all the other reasons that people actually do offend that had nothing to do with it?
Well, so what we did in this research, which was really only about the stop, is we took all those factors into account, and we basically built a model for a given individual based upon all those other factors. What's the likelihood they will offend? And then we added in their experience with the police and looked to see if it had any additional impact on them. And that's where I'm saying yes. I mean, obviously some people are more likely to offend no matter what the police do. And we take that out of this analysis so we can look separately at how they experience their treatment by the police and show that that's an independent factor. Yeah.
So, what you just described to me is, basically you're accounting for confounding in your analysis through your regression analysis. I guess what I'm particularly interested in is sort of the degree to which these relationships hold across different kinds of people and experiences. So, at least with respect to violent crime, excuse me, how young men perceive all of these things and respond is of greatest interest, and particularly at least for urban gun violence, young men of color, how they respond to this. So how robust, I guess, are all of these relationships when you look at sort of finer slices of pie?
Yes. Okay. So I think this is a really important question because we have a small group in our population that are basically career violent criminals. And many of you deal with those people repeatedly. So a good question to ask is, does any of this have anything to do with them? Fortunately, we do have some evidence about this. It's not a study that I was involved in. It's a study that my colleague Tracy Mears did. But it was of young men who were coming out of prison after serving a term for violent gun-related crimes. As you know, those individuals have a very high probability for recidivism. And so the question was, what can we do to lower the rate of recidivism? They did a simple experiment. Half the time they did the traditional post-release meeting with the police. That meeting, you sit, police officials stand up on a podium in front of you and they say, if you break the law, we're going to catch you, we're going to throw you back in prison, so don't break the law. Then there was a separate group where they tried to enact these principles of fair treatment. The police officers and the people coming out of prison sat down at a round table together. The officers said, our goal is to help you. We think that you can be successful in not going back to prison. We want to help you do that. We want to hear from you. What do you need from us? What kind of things could we do to help make that possible? So they gave them voice. They explained the policies and practices they would use. These are the policies we will be using. They treated the people respectfully. They didn't talk down to them. They sat at a round table together. 3 years later, 40% less likelihood of being rearrested in the procedural justice condition as in the other condition. So 1 or 2 hours of treatment, 40% change in the likelihood you'd be rearrested. And those are people that we might often have a tendency to say, oh, those are just hardened criminals. There's nothing we can do that will affect them. No, that's not true. Actually, we can do things that really will affect them, and those things come out of the same kind of model that I'm talking about here. So I do think that that's a good point. You know, the other point that I should emphasize for anyone who might be interested, you saw some equations flashing across the screen, and I tried not to emphasize those because I didn't think it would help to make the main message, but I have that. And so if any of you want to have a really dead weekend ahead of you and you want to read a paper full of statistics and regressions and all that kind of thing, I'd be happy to send those to you. Those papers are published. And so we do have where we show what does it mean to control for things and how do we make models about propensity and so on and so forth. All of that is available in quite a bit of detail. Yeah.
Just to extend this just a little bit, you're one of the things you're looking at is legitimacy and compliance and those kinds of things. So one of the things that determines whether someone commits crime or violence is very heavily dependent upon your peers, what influences they have, your perceptions of those peers. So is there any sense from your research or others that this whole idea of legitimacy also influences individuals to, in essence, keep their peers in mind? If you follow me?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Because that's central to at least some of the intervention models that you're trying to affect not only directly that individual's behavior, but if they are a part of a group, you're trying to affect that group as well.
Well, so the simple answer is no. That's a really interesting. I never thought about it that way. We definitely have evidence that people join gangs if they don't feel fairly treated by the police. We have evidence that they're more likely to bring weapons to school and activities like that, all of which suggests that they're being pushed into that lifestyle. But then the question you're asking pushes that further, and I don't actually know the answer. That's a great question to look at. I have not personally studied once people are in gangs, what happens next. We know that we're pushing people towards that lifestyle. Sir.
Well, I guess what's interesting is the corollary between sort of this law enforcement and, let's say, like medicine. So we have, patients, there's a fairly small group that take up a lot of resources, appear to be incorrigible. And then you have these ideas of sort of the engagement with the system. And what I see a lot of is just more in introductions. You asked your question about your thoughts, the introduction of technology. So like I read the newspaper, and I'm not from Baltimore, but just following this idea of body cameras everywhere, all this type of thing. But listening to this seems to suggest more of the personal interaction is much more powerful and much more persistent. So with this sort of push towards adding more technology to how we monitor the police or the interaction between police and citizenry, do you think that's going to be effective, or it's going to create less legitimacy because what you see may not be exactly what's happening?
Well, so two different levels of response. One is, I agree with the basic idea that I'm frustrated sometimes that I feel like people think technology is the solution to every problem. And when in the Floyd decision, the judge said, well, we've had all this trouble with the NYPD, but we'll fix it by having cameras on the police. I didn't think that was a very well thought through idea, because if the police aren't thinking of their job differently and aren't thinking these issues are important, whether they wear cameras or not is not good. And to put it in a legal sense, people are not constitutionally entitled to respectful treatment from the police. So the police officer who's rude to somebody on the street is not breaking the law. From my point of view, they're making a mistake in terms of building the legitimacy of the police, but a legal orientation won't get you there, because whether you have a camera, whether you're standing in front of one of those surveillance cameras, whether you're standing in front of the police commissioner, you're not doing anything illegal. So in that sense, I think that technology is good, but it's not a solution to these problems. On the other hand, if the issue is that the public doesn't trust the police, or the police don't trust the public, then having cameras and recording the interaction is a protection for both sides, basically. You protect the police because they can't be falsely accused. You protect the public because they don't feel like they'll be harassed. That, to me, is sort of a consequence of mistrust and not a way to build trust. Any students? Have any students have any questions? Okay, yeah.
If you want to generalize your model to, let's say, to a different country, for example, if you want to apply the same model to a different country, what will be your implications?
Can you repeat that, please?
If we wanted to apply this in different countries, what would be the limitations? And it's a great question. I think it's a really difficult question to answer because, like, all over the world, I mean, there's I'll give it, so I'll be specific. One of the interesting problems in Eastern Europe has been for the police who used to police basically kind of like street thugs to be told by these new democratic governments that they can't do that anymore. And I actually had the experience of where a bunch of Russian police officers were sent for some reason to come and be trained, and they were just bewildered. You know, you can't hit people, you can't shoot them, you know, what's going on? Like, you know, they didn't really, you know, what am I supposed to do? And so I think there are challenges. But where the police have been able to change their style of policing, they have been effective in building trust and changing the, you know, the culture of policing. And certain, like Slovenia is a country where there's a lot of progressive criminology. That's an example. But, you know, often the issues for police in other countries are beyond this. They're structural. Like, many police officers don't get paid or get paid very little, so they take bribes. You know, just telling them don't take bribes because then people won't trust you isn't really solving their problem. They need money, you know, they need to get paid. So you also have to be willing to change the structural features of policing, and that has often been more of a problem than changing the attitudes of the police officers.
Yes.
I wondered what some of the barriers have been for departments nationally in reorienting themselves towards this kind of approach and how they've been overcome.
Okay, well, I think one clear barrier is getting officer buy-in. Often police leaders are more seeing the kind of the big picture than the officers on the street. And so how do you get buy-in from those officers so that they actually are interested in thinking about this approach? In Chicago, they've basically retrained about 10,000 of the officers in the Chicago police force. They have an 8-hour training program along these lines. And what I have particularly liked about that training program is it focuses on the officers and their experiences. One experience that officers often have is concern about their safety. So there's research that suggests that being an officer who uses these approaches is actually likely to reduce risk, not increase it. But officers often don't feel that way because presenting kind of an image of force and dominating a situation feels like a safe way to approach people. We know from research that it's likely to escalate conflict and increases the likelihood that there'll be injury, often to the public, but also to officers. But officers, line officers, people on the street, have to be persuaded that that's true. The other thing that I think is really interesting, and I don't know if the officers here from Baltimore want to talk about this, but one of the things that I thought was fascinating about Chicago is I was sent to Chicago because the leaders of Chicago thought this would be good in terms of things they wanted, like compliance with the law, cooperation with the police. In the training programs with the police officers who were basically out on the street, their principal concern was this. This is all great. I've been a police officer for 20 years. No one has ever done any of these things for me. When I go into the station house, no one ever listens to me. No one ever explains anything. No one is ever courteous to me. I mean, they mean their superiors, courteous to me. I don't trust the motives of my leaders. You're telling me to do all these things when I deal with people out on the street. If they're so great, why don't my own superiors treat me that way? Now, that was a shock to me. But actually, now that I understand it better, I have advocated whenever I've gone to different police departments that you have to start within the department. That the legitimacy has to first be the officers feeling that their own leaders are legitimate for these very same reasons. Now, the good news is now I've done several studies of police departments. Everything that I say to you here about what people want when they deal with the police officers say they want those things when they deal with their superiors. It's exactly the same. There's no difference between police officers' reactions to their captains and people on the street reacting to officers they deal with. So we know how to create departments that will be legitimate, and we know from research that if officers experience their department as legitimate, they do these things out on the street more frequently. So that is something that I learned, and I think it goes back to the question, what do you have to do to make these changes work? You also have to be concerned about structure of the department. But maybe then the final thing I would say is, the other thing that officers talk about all the time is their own physical and mental health. Policing is a real, well, you guys know this, policing is a really stressful job. Police officers have all kinds of difficulties because of the stress of their job. They have health problems, high blood pressure, heart attacks, all kinds of health consequences of hypertension. They have divorces, they have suicides, they have drug use. You know, all of those things are problems with policing, and they're such problems with policing that the federal government has had a national task force on police suicide. Well, we know from research that all of those problems come from stress, and stress comes from the way you do your job. There's all this epidemiological research on not police in particular, but employees in general, that shows that people who have stressful jobs have all of these health problems. The kind of job that we're talking about, a police officer who's in constant conflict with the community, who's experiencing hostility when they deal with people, who's constantly worried about their safety, those are the people who have stress and they have all these problems. So it's also, from my point of view, important to stress that this is a win-win situation. If the police changed the style of policing, they wouldn't just be helping people in the community, they'd actually be helping themselves. And just as a general approach, my experience has been that one of the really helpful ways to approach unions is by pointing that out. Because once unions realize that these changes in strategy would be better for the welfare of their workers, the officers they represent, they're much more open to talking about them and thinking about them. So that's, I guess that's my general answer to your question.
I have a question that sort of gets to some of the data that you were getting into. Aside from the, this goes to the stop question, Chris. Policy. And, so you recorded the number of times someone went through that experience. Did you record any other information about the nature of those stops? You know, the degree to which an officer explained why they were being stopped. I'm just sort of curious what you learned more about the stops themselves.
Sure. Okay, so I probably went by that too fast. There was a term in there, intrusion. And intrusion is a summary term of a whole bunch of things like, did the officer dump your backpack out? Did the officer frisk you? Did the officer threaten to use force? Did they handcuff you? Did they put you in the police car? Sit you down on the, I mean, like about 15 different behaviors. We call that obtrusiveness, like how much did the person intrude into your life, basically. And then there's what they did, like explain, tell you what the policies were, listen to you, and that's what I'm calling procedural justice. The officer listened to me, he explained why he was stopping me, he treated me with courtesy and respect, and I felt he was trying to do the right thing in the situation. So those would be procedural justice issues. So those were helpful, and then surprisingly, degree of intrusion didn't have much effect. That was, we didn't think that would happen, but that's what we found. It was really more the interpretation of the experience and not the experience itself.
Years ago, we did some research on public and community attitudes about what you would, well, it has some similarities to the stop question fix, but generally, at least at that time, the practice was a much more smaller unit in a hot spot for shootings as opposed to NYPD's policies that have been very sweeping. And the units that DPD had in place at that time, I did ride-arounds, just to observe what they were doing. And how they explained what they were doing was very interesting, as well as what we learned from the community surveys. They immediately wanted to make the point that they're not looking for drugs. That this was a gun squad. We're here looking because we don't want people getting shot, people carrying guns. In our community surveys, there was a pretty big difference between how they viewed the police and what they do with respect to drugs. And there was guns there. And what they were doing with guns. So very generally, much more acceptance that the police need to address illegal gun carrying. At least, we were focused again in areas of Baltimore with the greatest number of shootings. So, so I was just wondering if in any of your, either in the data you collect in the survey or when you're talking with people, any of this sort of comes out, the degree to which, did the risk occur in a place with a lot of shootings or not, or any of those things, or how the officer explained it as, we're doing this to keep you from being shot, or we just, like to arrest people, or,
Well, we did not do the kind of nuanced analysis that you're talking about. It would have been really hard to do in this survey. We did look at the degree of explanation and whether the person ended up feeling that there was a legitimate reason for the stop, but we didn't then say what was the legitimate reason. That would be actually a really interesting follow-up to, we spent a lot of our time in this survey asking about a degree of intrusion, which we thought would be really important, and it turned out actually wasn't so important. So that was a mistake on our part, and it would have been more interesting to actually ask those questions. So we know it's important that there be an explanation, but the actual content of the explanation we're not sure about from this study. So I should say to all of you officers or students or whatever that there are a lot of interesting publications now put out by the COPS office, the national office that deals with policing research. If any of you are interested in these ideas, COPS has videotapes, they have pamphlets that they've put together, that they've organized, that are designed to be, they're written by police officers. They're designed to try to talk about how this information can be useful in policing. So I recommend all those to you as potential ways to follow up on this. There's also a website called proceduralfairness.org, which the National Center for State Courts keeps up to date, that has many, many publications and lectures and material of different kinds. So if you have any interest, that would be another place to look, and I know that's being updated all the time. So there are places to go to get more information about this.
Well, I want to thank you. This has been really great.